Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Priceless podcast. This is the Priceless news section, and today I have a very special person who is, I actually don't know what to say where he's from. He's from almost everywhere. And hearing him speak, he speaks many languages. He's a person of the world. What else should I say? And I'm really glad to have him as a guest because something very special happened at the church that he's from, that he's part of. So I asked him to share this news because I think that's exactly what we're looking in this section of Priceless News. You know already that all the links, if there be any links, will be in the podcast description. Please like us, share, subscribe, tell others about this. And of course, you can always, if you want this podcast to continue, help us with a donation. So let's go to our guest. Hello, Joey. How are you?
Hi. It's so good to be here today and to have this audience listening to us. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, it always is for me. You know, I always think of, okay, I need to kind of kick out some of those words that I use all the time, but I always get nervous right when I start recording it. So exactly. I know how you feel. Tell me, how are you surviving this craziness that is happening in the world everywhere?
Trying to get by. I mean, first of all, everything has gone online, right? So all of my meetings, any type of connection that I have is through online Zoom meetings or WhatsApp meetings or any type of social media that we're using, which in some ways has been a blessing. We've really raised our content level in the community of Christ, especially for the things that we're doing. So there's more videos out there and there's more podcasts and things like that. But that's how we've tried to stay connected with people, is through online means.
Yeah. Well, we are all getting used to Zoom, there are many great sides to things that we learned during this pandemic. But of course, there are horrible things and getting used to this craziness. Well, let's start with you telling us a little bit, because the church I'm talking about is Community of Christ. That's the church that you're from. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about who is the Community of Christ?
Yeah, so Community of Christ is a Christian denomination. And a lot of times people try to classify where we're from.
Labels.
Labels.
We love our labels.
It does help people, I think, in many ways. I think some of the ways that I would describe who we are, we basically came out of the primitive movement that you could call that the Restoration movement as well. People that were returning to what they felt was the original church that you read, that comes out of Luke, and you really get into that in the book of Acts. So what is this community that is formed, that shares everything among themselves, and where there are no poor among them? That's a big, important line for Community of Christ. So what does it mean to form communities? And in fact, our mission statement is, we proclaim Jesus Christ and promote communities of joy, hope, love, and peace. And so that's part of who we are. People say, are you more Catholic? Are you more Protestant? And certainly that primitive movement comes out more of the Protestant movement as pilgrims, for example, were getting out of Europe and coming to the United States. And then a couple of denominations began to be formed throughout that, from that movement. And Community of Christ is one of those. And so we have our beginnings in the early 1800s in the United States. And then now we've expanded, especially after World War II. A lot of churches began to expand into the world. And so we have a presence, I think, in more than 60 countries around the world now.
Maybe one thing that was very interesting to me is the way you function about making decisions and keeping I don't even know. I mean, I know you have a special name for that, and I don't remember what it's really called, but you can maybe talk a little bit about that. But I find you as a living church that is making decision that values the Bible, but also things we are living in this time, in this day, and we need to see what's happening around us. And as a community, we need to make some decisions and bring some new ideas that are valuable for society nowadays. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. I think what you're referring to is our common consent process.
Yes.
So when we make important decisions, it's more than just a 51%, that you have to have a majority vote to decide on something very important. Because as we don't want to break the body of Christ, as we want to hold on together as much as we can to move forward whenever we make important decisions, we've developed a common consent process. And I'll just tell you a few parts of it right now. One of those things would be is we would just have a time of research and looking for information. So we would just spend time reflecting, going out, finding what people have researched on a certain topic. And then we will sit and we'll work with that information, but we'll also have something called listening circles, in which if there's an important discussion, so for example, on the LGBT discussion, we might sit down and just listen to people share their perspectives, where there's no debate, there's no challenging of that perspective, but it is just a pure moment of listening. We call those listening circles. And then there's other opportunities to share together, to learn together, also to dialogue together, where there is an exchange of ideas and how we feel. But then when we come to actually begin to make the decision as well, and you were there for that conference because we had invited you,
Yes.
You saw how we tried to put that into practice. So we took a survey of the room. So where are you right now with this topic? How do you feel? And that was based on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 would be, I am completely against this. I will stand up against this and speak against this. And where 5 would be, I am completely supportive of this. I'm all in. And then obviously people can be somewhere on that scale. But that's to just get an idea of where are we. And then as we see where people are, we then ask people with 1s and 2s to share their perspectives so that we can hear, well, why are you so against this?
Yeah.
And then we listen to people with 3s and 4s, and then we listen if there's anyone who is completely for the argument, that they'll then stand up and share those perspectives. And we do that several times before we actually get to a final vote. And then in a final vote, we ask for 2/3 to be able to move forward with an important topic. Now, if we were deciding what color the floor or the walls should be in one of our churches, it might be a majority vote. But sometimes those are actually really important discussions. So if it's going to be really divisive in the discussion, then we actually might use that same type of decision-making process for even smaller decisions so that we don't lose people along the way.
Yeah, I love that process. And as you said, I was there at this conference that we are actually talking about, because something important was decided, and that's why we're making this video, because it concerns LGBT people plus. So can you tell me, what decision did the community of Christ make? If I'm not wrong, it was for West Europe that this decision was made. And it was the community of different representatives from different churches all over Western Europe. But let the listeners and the viewers know what actually happened that weekend on that conference.
Yeah, so there were 2 really important recommendations that were made that weekend to change policy in Community of Christ. And the first one was on marriage for persons in same-sex relationships. And so what that recommendation then allowed was to change the policy so that there would be a provision to allow for the sacrament of marriage for persons of the same sex that wanted to get married. Now, in Europe, as you know, this decision was made for 38 different countries in Europe. And so not everyone has the same laws.
Yeah.
There is not same-sex marriage available in every country of those 38 countries. And so we made provisions where the sacrament would be allowed wherever marriage was possible. And where marriage wasn't possible, but there was something like a life partnership or civil union, then there would be a covenant blessing ceremony that would be made available for persons of the same sex. So that was the first recommendation. And then the second one, which in some ways is linked to it, was ordination to priesthood for persons who are in a same-sex marriage or covenantal relationship.
And how did that go at the end?
Well, it passed.
I just pretend that I don't know, you know?
Yeah, so that scale that I was telling you about with the 5, right, that you could vote, I'm totally against this, which would be a 1 or a 2. 1 or 2s are mainly non-supportive. 3, 4s, and 5s are pretty good levels of support. Yeah. And so we required a 2/3, 3, 4s, and 5s to be able to then make that recommendation for policy change. And it was 100% of 3, 4s, and 5s. Now, not everyone voted 5. Not everyone was completely, all in supportive. But we did have everyone that voted was within a 3, 4, and a 5, which was surprising because we've had other conferences where that has not been true. There have been people that still were 1s and 2s. But even people that shared those perspectives, many of them still gave testimonies at the end of our conference, telling how much they appreciated that they were able to share their voice and feel safe about sharing their voice.
Yes.
And that they wanted to continue with Community of Christ, which I think is the whole goal. That if we're going to move forward with this important decision, we still want to bring people along with us.
Yes. Yes. So how did it get to that point that you decided to make this decision? I guess that there were many steps, but can you say it in a few sentences? Describe a little bit the journey that you went through to get to this point.
Yeah, so I think the first important thing to mention, especially for the LGBTQ plus community, is that people for years have been wanting to see this type of change in churches, all sorts of churches, but even in Community of Christ, probably since the 70s. Yeah. People have been standing up and asking for change, or there have been proposals at our world conferences to try to have more inclusion of the LGBT community. And so it's really important to recognize that work, first of all. Yeah. But what really made it possible is policy decisions like this have been made for the entire world church before this actual conference that we had. Because since things were made for the entire church, so how do you make this decision for a country such as the Congo, where it is illegal to be gay or to say that you're gay, and the consequences that could come from that? Well, in Community of Christ, we have something called continuing revelation. And so we have the ability to have words of counsel that we then vote in as part of kind of our doctrine and what we believe in. And so in 2010, our president provided a document that said, basically, and I think I have it here to share with you, but it allowed for different countries to make some decisions that were important in their areas. And so this was really interesting because what it really was saying was this isn't a theological question. This is a question of policy and when are certain areas ready to move forward to change that policy. And I think that was really affirming for the LGBT community because it wasn't like God needed to say that it was okay to be LGBT. It was as if God had already said that. It's just that people weren't ready for that. The policies that people had created were blocking marriage and ordination and that type of ministry.
And as much as I know, actually, a lot of countries already said that they kind of agreed with this, what you were now deciding on a European level. And even it was already decided in the States and Canada, if I'm not wrong, is it?
Yeah, Canada and Australia had conferences before the US.
Yeah.
And then the United States had their conference. The UK had their conference. And even in Europe, we had already held conferences in places where we have more members. So in Norway and in the Netherlands and in Germany, we had already held conferences. So this conference we had last November in 2019, it actually just allowed for our entire missional region of Western Europe, because we needed a consistent message, right? When someone called me from Croatia, for example, and said, what do you say about LGBT rights? It was hard to say, well, we don't really have a presence in Croatia. And so once we have a presence and enough members, then we can ask to have a conference in which we'll discuss the issue to then move forward towards policy change. It was too much. We needed to be able to have a consistent message to share, especially in countries where we are not present.
Yeah. Okay, and the last question I have for you is, what do you think that this means for the community of Christ and also for the LGBT plus members of Community of Christ, this decision?
Well, we held kind of a milestone celebratory online event last week, and we invited you to that. So you could even share a little bit about that. But I think just from that event, what I really saw was our LGBT members that are in Europe, how meaningful this was for them, as many of them are new to Community of Christ. And so I think they actually turned their heads towards Community of Christ because they were looking for an inclusive, affirming. And I think that's an important word, because I think we want to go beyond inclusive. Inclusive assumes that someone's excluded and someone's letting someone in. But won't it be great if we can get to a point where Community of Christ is an affirming community, where wherever you're from and whatever your background, we can affirm your worth as a person, your dignity, but also we can affirm your ministry, that you have something to offer and contribute, and that is just as equal and valid and spiritual and beautiful as anyone else in what they have to contribute. So for me, I think it has this beautiful aspect that's already there, but it also is a great challenge. Because we have to look still inside. We already had to look inside to say, can we move forward with this policy change? But we still need to look inside and say, what does it mean to be an affirming community? And recognize where we are not there. And then start to ask the questions, what do we do? What small changes do we make? How do we plan out our lives that we truly live into the words that we're now speaking? Is this good news for people? That's the sense I got last week, was for the LGBT community, this is good news. This is the good news of the gospel, perhaps, that's being shared here with people. And so when people are liberated and made free, how do we then continue that liberation? How do we continue to open ourselves? How do we make sure we don't get to a place where we go, well, that's enough. You've had your freedom, and so, and I think that's part of that moving from being an inclusive church to being an affirming church.
I have to say that hearing this from you is really interesting, because mostly what I hear from people is not being afraid about, are we gonna, how are we not gonna stop, but when are we gonna stop? People are more scared of change than of, being stuck. That's my experience, but I'm happy to hear that there are different experiences. So one question I wasn't really planning to ask, but it just came to me, is what is the greatest challenge right now with this decision?
So I think one of the biggest challenges is one, supporting. I'm thinking first of all of the ordination side of this, and how we continue to support ministers who now will be ordained and step out into ministry, because LGBT persons have always been able to do that in Community of Christ. They just haven't been able to be married.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So there's been a type of acceptance for the LGBT community, but what does it mean for someone to step out in ministry in Europe, wherever they are, and say, me and my partner, because in Community of Christ you can be married and be an ordained minister. What does it mean to support people when there may be environments that will not accept that ministry, or the rejection that might come from that? There will be certainly some places that will open their arms and they will rejoice in this decision. But there will be other places. And one example of that is, I was in Brussels a few years ago, beginning to set up a church with someone who had contacted Community of Christ. And of course, one of the first ways that you do that is you have that contact person invite other people they've been talking to sit around the table and listen to Community of Christ. And we did an all-day event on a Saturday, started in the morning at around 9 a.m., and people were excited, and we were going through all the information about Community of Christ. And one of the other persons I had invited from Community of Christ, who was a priesthood member, is a man who is married to another man. And at the end of the day, as we were walking back to the metro, he shared with one of the people there that he was married. And the following day, our group of 14 people, when they came back to this retreat that we were having, was down to 3 people.
Wow.
And that was disappointing. And my role became not to let this person think that because they shared that they were married, that this got in the way. And the most affirming thing actually came from the contact. The contact that we had said, you know what? We will find other people to sit around this table. And so I was humbled by that moment, but also I was so happy that it came from the person who was looking towards Community of Christ, who said, you know what? I recognize already this is who you are as a people and as a community, and that you value the worth of all persons, and that all people have a calling and are called in Community of Christ. You value the worth of diversity. And so we will move forward and we will find other people who also understand this. So that for me was the beautiful moment of that, was when this person said, you know what, let's move forward. But then in my role, being the organizer of all these activities all over Europe, I want to make sure that I'm there and that other ministers are there to support persons who step out now in faith and with joy and excitement, because there may still, unfortunately, be some obstacles in front of them. And I think we need to be sure that we continue to support people as we begin to live out truly what it means to become this diverse community and value the worth of all persons.
Thank you, Joey, so much. What a great story to kind of round up our conversation. Thank you for taking the time to be with me and sharing about Community of Christ and the decision you made. I was a small part of it, and I'm just sending my congratulations to all of you, and I'm looking forward to staying in touch with you and also with some members, hoping to have some of your members as guests on my podcast. So thank you again. And to all you viewers and listeners, thank you for watching and listening. All the links will be below in the podcast description. As I said, like, subscribe, and share with others. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.